Hey, what is going on everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, and welcome to another episode of ModChat. For those who do not know, this here is my podcast I do in which I cover things that I find new, interesting, cool, or what have you in the world of video game modding and video game console modding. Now, this is available in two different forms. First of all, it is available in a video visual form here on the Mr. Mario 2011 YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey channels. And secondly, it is available like an actual podcast, so you can take it around and listen to it wherever the hell you want to in an audio only form. Simply look up ModChat, all one word, on your favorite podcasting app, host, provider, or platform, and you should hopefully be able to find it. I know it's not available on all of them, but it is available on most of them. Either way, like I was saying earlier, this here is ModChat, in which I come on here at least once a month and I talk to you all about things that I find new, interesting, or cool, or what have you in the world of video game modding and video game console modding. Now, usually at the beginning here, I do show myself on camera, but I'm going to be honest, I decided not to do that here because, well, I want to play some video games. What you're seeing is, you know what, I promise it's not as bad as it once was when it released, but this is the definitive edition, I know, mind you, but this is the definitive edition of Grand Theft Auto 3, the Switch version running on Switch 2. And I also partially did this for a couple reasons. One, I ended up starting up a new game on this again. I kind of did the Pokemon thing where I just went in and I decided to delete all of my saves and just start from the beginning because that's always what I've done with this game. And secondly, I also ended up getting a new capture card that I wanted to mess around with and test and verify and made sure it worked. So I said, you know what, let me just take the game I'm currently playing and capture some footage here. So that's what you're seeing at the moment. By the way, for the capture card, I ended up getting the Elgato 4KX, I believe that's it. A nice upgrade, a pretty substantial upgrade from the S Plus, like the HD60 S Plus that I was using before, mainly for the fact that this one actually works properly. My old one kind of got to the point where I used it so much and it was having so many issues that I think I kind of burned it out. If I just ran it for like a long enough time, it would have so many issues. I'm not kidding, but even from the beginning, it was not great. We're getting a little bit off topic here though. Hopefully you all at least enjoyed the gameplay on this, but there's been a lot of stuff. Again, I know it hasn't been that long since we recorded the last episode of ModChat, but there's been so much stuff here that I'm like, I kind of got to get out an episode now because it just keeps stacking. So here's another really long episode. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to make it super long, but there was just so much stuff to track on here, and we're not even done. There's developments that I wish I could have covered on here, but they just weren't fully developed yet. So there's going to have to be another episode another time. Either way, let's go ahead and just get right into these topics. Now, we're starting off strong here talking about one of my favorite custom firmwares here, Atmosphere. This is a, as it says here, work in progress customized firmware for the Nintendo Switch. And for those who do not know, if you have a Nintendo Switch which is modified in some way in the modern day, unless you're using something such as Linux on it, if you're using the standard operating system and you're modifying it, you're no doubt most likely going to be using Atmosphere custom firmware. This is the main custom firmware which is out, the main one that is still supported, and to my knowledge, the only public one that is still supported here. Now, it ended up going through a little bit of a shakeup because the main developer behind this, Cyrus M, I've covered this in one or two episodes, ended up retiring at least publicly. So there was a lot of worry over whether this would still be supported or not, and I said multiple times, look at how many contributors are here. Also, this is open source, so it looks like the project is still going to get maintained, it is going to be in good hands, and I even said there that if it is at the point where only one person, Cyrus M, is capable of actually maintaining and fully releasing Atmosphere and nobody else can pick up the mantle, I think the scene has bigger issues than just one person retiring. However, I'm not just coming to you with one update, I'm actually coming to you with two different updates here because, well, there were two updates to the Switch. The first one here is with Atmosphere 1.11.0 dropping, which this one here I'm just going to cover really quick. Ended up mainly adding support for system version 22.0.0, which is of course a major version change. Now, I'm not going to cover too much on this one here because this ended up taking at least a couple weeks in order to get Atmosphere up and running, and you can even see here that as opposed to Cyrus M handling the release, this time around it was Hexkeys, and they do mention with special thanks to Alula, who was one of the people, if not the person I had shown, who was working on this, they had shown their proof that they were getting this to work initially on Twitter, but they, as well as many other contributors, were saying, hey, it's going to take time to work on this here. Now, I'm not going to cover this version specifically too much, because while as 22.0.0 was out for about a couple of weeks, and then we finally ended up getting an Atmosphere custom firmware, like right after, it seemed like within a day or two of the custom firmware dropping, Nintendo ended up releasing 22.1.0, and because this is a major firmware release here, the old version of Atmosphere did not work, which meant that they had to release another version. Typically, let's say if this was 22.0.1, typically this older version would still work on there. I haven't seen it not work, but if this second number here, since this was a major firmware revision, since that ended up changing, they had to make a whole new version of Atmosphere right after they released the other one. So that was a bit funny, and this is the main one we're going to focus on here. So of course it did get support for 22.1.0, which at the time of recording is the latest system software version for the Switch, and of course we do have general system stability improvements to enhance the user's experience, both for this here since the last release, as well as what was in 11.1.0. Now they do give special thanks to Alula for handling a large chunk of the necessary kernel, loader, and ERPT changes. They state that the console should boot and Atmosphere should fully be functional, but they do want to note this here. A change in how applications' applet's lifespan is managed broke the homebrew ecosystem. All applications and applets are expected to perform a clean exit by calling the relevant IPC commands. Homebrew compiled with libnx and hbmenu itself explicitly avoid exiting so it can keep using the same process. Properly fixing this would require a redesign of how Homebrew is launched and terminated. As a temporary solution, patches to the AM-sys module are now included, which allow restoring the previous behavior and regain Homebrew compatibility without any further issues. Nonetheless, please report any issues you may face when testing Homebrew to ensure no edge cases have been missed. And this here was a big one. This was actually a big hangup as to why the new version of Atmosphere took so long to release. Essentially, what we saw around here, this is near the end of last year with 1.10.0, and this is when 21, that version, ended up coming out. We end up seeing this, and I talked about it and mentioned it several times. This is when here Nintendo broke the userland to kernel TLS ABI in 21.0.0 by writing to previously reserved space. And this ended up having an issue which you can still even verify it to this day. If you are running the latest Atmosphere and if you're running the latest firmware, if you run any piece of Homebrew which was compiled before here, November 15th, 2025, let's say you run a piece of Homebrew from 2024, it's going to crash, it might not even work properly, it might not even launch properly, and it's going to have issues. So any of that old Homebrew or those old applets need to be recompiled with the latest libnx. And there was another change to libnx, which is why this ended up taking so long right here. However, as opposed to doing a whole rewrite there or even a whole recompilation effort for these applications and applets, they end up saying here, like it said, they have patches to the AM-sys module, so now you can have that old Homebrew behavior and regain that compatibility without any further changes. That way, as opposed to actually fixing up the SDK or the Homebrew itself, they end up just putting the patches into the custom firmware, which is pretty convenient and pretty nice and something really impressive there, so a big shout out to them for this. Additionally, we also see the typical things of Exosphere was updated, Mesosphere was updated, the loader, ERPT, PGL was updated here. There's also been support added for memory modes above 4 GB, so if you're going to have some fun with a rework station there and you want to put more RAM physically inside of your Switch, you do have support for that here, and a build time option to configure Joy-Con rails as UART for debugging was added. That's actually pretty cool. Alright, I guess Alula ended up doing that, but that's pretty neat right there. Either way, that covers the latest firmware release in Atmosphere here, so if you're on a older firmware, you can now update to the latest system firmware, you can run the latest Atmosphere and have some fun. And give a big shout out to the team here for having the first 2 releases without Cyrus-M, and certainly running into, I would say, a big issue and a big hurdle that they had to tackle. Seriously, awesome job. Speaking of the Switch, there's also another project I end up seeing here, which end up releasing as open source, but is also available on a website from developer Ruben JDS. And this here is WebRCM. And when I saw this, not only I thought it was cool, but I was actually pretty surprised that we hadn't seen this before. They state this is a modern web-based Fuse Jelly exploit tool for Nintendo Switch using WebUSB. And essentially here, well, let's go ahead and read it. WebRCM allows you to send payloads like Hecate or Fuse Atmosphere to a Nintendo Switch in RCM mode directly from your browser. No software installation required. This project is a modernized rewrite of previous web-based RCM tools. I created it because I wanted up-to-date payload releases, so this is pretty cool because they say that it has automated daily checks for new Hecate and Fuse releases via GitHub Actions, and a payload version library. So you can keep the latest several versions available, and you can choose exactly which version you want to inject. So I guess even reading this here, I never really looked into these as much. I guess there were some web-based RCM injectors before. Typically, I end up using an application or a payload injector or like an app on my phone. So the nice thing is, essentially, if you're not sure how this works, if you have an original Nintendo Switch, which was manufactured within the first 12 months or so, that means it would be an unpatched switch, so that way you don't have to solder in a mod chip, you don't have to do any of that stuff in order to run custom firmware. You can just get a jig, load it up on the side, and then you can boot the system into RCM mode. And as opposed to using an application on your computer, or using an app on your phone, or getting a payload injector directly, you can go to this site right here. Check this out, you're able to select your payload, so there are several available for Hecate. Atmosphere, they also have a few Fuse ones there, and you can also upload your own here. And from here, you just have to connect your Switch to your computer in RCM mode. You have to allow access to this on your browser, and then from here, you can inject and launch your payload. Now, it has instructions covering this, which is pretty much exactly what I said there. Platform compatibility. Funny enough, even though I'm showing this on Windows, it looks like this works on Linux, Mac, Android unrooted, that's cool, and Chrome OS, but it does not work on Windows due to the WebUSB limitation. So they do say for Windows users, you need to use Tegra RCM Smash or Tegra RCM GUI. And lastly, for browser support, this pretty much works for most browsers out there, really Chromium-based browsers. So it says Google Chrome, Edge, Opera, Samsung Internet, Chromium-based browsers, of course, but Firefox, Safari, and iOS browsers are not supported. So a pretty cool option here if you want to use a website to inject your payloads. Now, this is something I've gotten so many questions about, and this is with the PS3 4.93 system update. For those who do not know, there was a firmware update to the PS3. It typically happens once a year around March or April, and I'm going to give you all some updates over what's going on. But if you're wondering why the PS3 is still being updated, or if there was a big reason for the update, it's essentially to maintain the AACS keys on the system itself. It's really not a method to snuff out mods or anything. We really haven't seen any effort to do that in many years. But in order to still maintain the Blu-ray playback on the PS3 for modern Blu-ray discs, they have to update the AACS keys manually, and the only way to do that is through firmware update. So essentially, as long as Sony still wants to support Blu-ray playback on the PlayStation 3, like Blu-ray movie playback or TV shows or any of that, it's still going to get these yearly firmware updates, which is pretty impressive for a system that was released in 2006. Either way, I've gotten a lot of questions over what to do, how to remod the system, how to mod the system, any of that. So at this point here, I'm going to give the current updates over what's going on. First of all, there was a firmware update from EVILNAT. This here is custom firmware 4.93, which in short is made out of, it says here, 4.93 official firmware. And it has all the good, wonderful things we typically expect from the EVILNAT custom firmware. You can also see Cobra has been updated to version 8.5 and has been integrated into this here. Now, there are a ton of features that you can see on here and read this. And unfortunately here, I'm looking for a bit of a changelog itself, because I would be curious to see what the differences are directly between 4.92 and 4.93, or I guess the last version of 4.92. It doesn't have a changelog specifically for that one, but I do encourage you, if you are interested, to check out the features that are available here. Yes, there's a ton of features on here, but many of these are features that were already baked into the previous versions of the custom firmware. So it's still nice to see that these have been up to date and that EVILNAT is still working on this. However, that is to say here that just because a custom firmware is out yet does not mean we can completely modify our systems through the web browser. For anyone who does not know, the most popular way to install custom firmware on a PS3 is using the PS3 toolset. Now that is made by bGaryville and it is maintained by bGaryville, as well as with some help, I believe, from the PS3 exploit team. The downside to this, however, is that it is closed source, it is hosted on that site. So at this moment in time, the toolset only supports up to firmware 4.92. So if you have a system on 4.93 that is compatible with custom firmware, you either have to wait for the PS3 toolset to get updated, or you're going to have to open up your system and patch your system yourself with a hardware flasher. A lot of people do also ask me, how long is the wait going to be? How long is that going to take? And I'm going to answer you all here. I don't know. I'm not the person for that. And if you want to be respectful to the developers, just wait and don't ask those questions. That's going to be my opinion on that. However, if you're absolutely dying to have unsigned code access on your PS3 and you do not want to open it up and use a hardware flasher, well, there's another option here. You always have the option for PS3HEN, which is nice because this is another software-only solution. There has been a new version of the hybrid firmware HFW, which has been released here, and that means that PS3HEN has been updated to 3.50. Now for the global changes, they state here that they've added support for the 4.93 firmware, and as for resource changes, they've fixed update HEN option in the HFW tools menu, they've added a homebrew app section in the update menu in HFW tools, and they've also added in webman mod, multiman mod, monoguns, as well as the rebug toolbox to homebrew apps menu. Actually, that's really cool seeing the rebug toolbox in there again. Like that's nice. That's a nice throwback right there. But either way, I do show this here because not only this does work on every single version of the PS3, but like I said, all you need is a USB drive and access to an internet browser on your system, and you can install it on there. So that way, if you want kind of a bit of a half step while you wait for custom firmware, in case your system has been fully updated or you got an up-to-date system and you can't install that custom firmware just yet, you can use PS3HEN to hold you over until you can install custom firmware. PS3HEN is still a great solution out there and one that I still recommend, so have fun with it. And lastly, there's not only those two options anymore, there's technically three options now, because now with the option of using bad WDSD, you now also have qCFW, which is essentially what I had talked about before, where you can take a Raspberry Pi Pico and you can install it physically into a slim or certain super slim models. You can install it in the NOR models, but you cannot install it. There's no support for it just yet from what I've seen for the eMMC modules. So that means if you have a PS3 super slim, like one of those like 12GB ones, you cannot use qCFW on it. I do hope that support comes for that soon, but that's not available at the moment. However, this is another option that people have been looking at, and there might be people who've installed qCFW who are wondering what they can do in their situation. And there is actually a response here from the developer Omsen2526. They stated here last month, "It's time to announce this. I have no plan to rebase qCFW to 4.93 or newer. Since I checked PSN login and it still worked fine because EVILNAT adds firmware version check bypass patch already. So there is no need for it." So for anybody who's reading that and they might be wondering, okay, hey, I have this system here, I have 4.93 on it, what does that mean? Does that mean I just can't install qCFW? Or if I have qCFW, does that mean I can't update? What's going on? I did look at the other comments here, and there were some answers to this. I'm going to find the one and cite it real quick. So here, Magnetize2068 ended up answering someone who is stating here, "So if I'm planning to do the mod later on, is it not recommended to update to 4.93 at the moment? Won't this prevent users who updated to install regex?" And they end up stating here, "As far as I remember, with ModChip, it should be possible to downgrade on 4.92, and then install HEN and qCFW." And there's going to be more on that here, well, in a few seconds. Magnetize did jump back in here with someone asking, can we upgrade to 4.93? And they stated here, you can have HFW 4.93, but installing qCFW will downgrade your console to 4.92. Omsen said he's not planning on 4.93 release. So just keep that in mind if you're going to be doing that there. As they say, if you're on the latest 4.93 and you want to install this here, you can install 4.93 HFW, then you can go through the process of installing PS3HEN, then you can go through the process of installing qCFW, but once you do that, it will downgrade you to 4.92, in which you'll need to use that EVILNAT firmware check bypass if you do want to get online. For anybody who might be thinking that's a little too much work for them, or they don't want to do that, or they don't like that solution, from what I'm seeing here, Omsen has said they don't plan to rebase this for 4.93, as I said earlier. However, from what I understand, all of this is also out there in open source, so much like other patches and firmwares and all that stuff we've seen in the PS3 scene, if someone else wants to take qCFW and rebase it to 4.93, that is totally on them, and I think it'd be appreciated by the community. But again, those are your options if you have qCFW. Now we're going to be getting into some releases here related to the PlayStation 5, and I guess one related to the PS4, but here I did want to cite this from Dr. Yin Yin, which is really just a giant readme here with a lot of screenshots and such, and if you are wanting to check this out, everything's linked down below in the description of the video upload, so that way you can read this more in depth yourself if you're wanting to. But Dr. Yin Yin ended up doing a write-up here called Why It Is Not That Easy. And they were stating here that this is to explain why it's not easy to just use this kernel exploit with Y2JB or the Japanese Lua games and other cheap options. This is for people who are mainly wanting to know why they have to have Star Wars Racer Revenge in order to jailbreak their PS5, or even use it as an option to unpatch the BDJ option on there so they can use a BDJB disk. Now they state here that syscalls, we can say, are system functions that you run to gain an effect and etc. The net control kernel exploit requires a system call to achieve the exploit. The dupe system call is required to trigger and reach the result required to, in the end, gain control of the system. The applications that are able to make that call are WebKit, BDJ, and the PS2 emulator. Although PS View can do it too, it is a PS4 only userland, and after a whole night of some very talented people trying, they could not get PS View to work on PS5. So due to the requirement of specific applications that are able to make the syscall required, the situation is already restrictive. A WebKit exploit has been found in years, so there we go, we've knocked out WebKit. BDJ is also difficult to work with, and a usable one hasn't been available past 7.61. Although we can unpatch a BDJ exploit with another jailbreak, this still doesn't solve for needing the very expensive game if you are on the 10.20 to 12.00 range. So now that we've discussed WebKit and BDJB, we're going to look at the PlayStation 2 emulator. I've already covered those ones, but now with this explained, they're asking here why Okagi and other PS2 games are not an easy option. And it's stated that after firmware 7.61, Sony blocked syscalls the PS2 emulator is allowed to run, which are required to fully run any kernel exploit and gain control to jailbreak. This is why Okagi and other similar games are not an option to run this kernel exploit. As you can see, this is even more restrictive now and makes things even harder, and this isn't even the end of how hard it's getting. Now again, if you want to see this in more detail, I'd recommend you give this a read here, but going past these screenshots here and kind of getting you to the meat of it here, Gezine was the one who was working on this, and then they started working on the JIT or just-in-time exploit, which they state here this exploit would allow to run the kernel exploit anyway, and on completion it did. However, this was different here because they state upon completion of the just-in-time exploit, Gezine had a thought he shared which led to a small discussion. He thought of taking a look at the PS2 emu of the other games to see if the just-in-time exploit would be compatible with them, and he found the thing that wraps up how difficult and how lucky the situation is. And essentially this comes down to each PS2 game's just-in-time compiler elf in the game itself, because essentially each of these PS2 games released on the PS4, or I guess PS5, but let's say PS4 here, because these are PS4 games being used on the PS5. let me just explain this, right? They are going to be PS4 packages, and inside of that package is a PlayStation 2 emulator, and inside of that emulator is a PlayStation 2 ISO. But each of the emulators is different, and it's built in different ways here. Now, each of them does seem to have a just-in-time compiler with how the emulation works, but the just-in-time compilers for each game are going to be a bit different. So that means, for example, Akagi's is going to be different than Fahrenheit, is going to be different than Star Wars Racer Revenge. But they state here that Star Wars Racer Revenge seems to be on 0.4, and Akagi is on 1.2, which means here that Star Wars Racer Revenge, at least out of the PlayStation 2 games they have found, seems to be the lowest version one with the just-in-time compiler, and that means that that older just-in-time compiler baked into Star Wars Racer Revenge is going to be more vulnerable, which means we're able to use that game specifically because of the just-in-time compiler being used in it to end up using this newer exploit and the newer jailbreaks. But other games such as, like I said, Akagi and Fahrenheit would not have that available. So even with these requirements, if you have a game exploit to get Mastercore Userland and you have a physical release of it, just in case you have someone who they didn't end up buying the game and then taking their system offline, in addition to all that, even if you satisfy those two requirements, it still must be compatible with the available just-in-time exploit, or be ready to find another game. And they even state here it may not exist, so it might just be a waste of time. So that is kind of why we're in a little bit of a lucky spot, dare I say here, with Star Wars Racer Revenge. So if there is another PS2 game that does have that older just-in-time compiler in there, then that could be exploited. And if that is not found, or if that's not available, then that means that there's just going to have to be another exploit that will have to be found and utilized, which of course is going to take a whole lot of time. So hopefully that does help out explain some of the frustrations here, but it's kind of frustrating not just from the end user perspective, but even from the developer and reverse engineer perspective as well. Now let's go ahead and get into the developments here. Now this is certainly something that is not new by any means, and this is from developer Al Azif. However, this here is PS4 RE Utilities, RE being short for reverse engineering utilities. Now, I'm sharing this here because they ended up showing this on April Fool's Day, I believe, and while as this here is nothing new, these, to my understanding, are sets of Python scripts which can help aid with reverse engineering of the PlayStation 4, and these are scripts that have been around and been used for years. It's just now they are public because, well, if these things are out there and they're public, they can help out more people, and more developers who aren't even in the scene who are just getting into it could have a little bit of a easier time actually doing what they're wanting to do here. It's stated here this is a collection of dependency-free Python utilities designed to assist with PS4 reverse engineering tasks. Now for the goals and philosophy, they state here that the primary goal of these utilities is to simplify common reverse engineering tasks related to the PS4, such as simplify common tasks, provide tools and proofs of concept to extract key information such as secure kernel, module, and self keys, and handle specific file formats such as splitting kernel components or extracting embedded selfs. Also reduce tooling complexity, lower the barrier to entry by minimizing the need for complex reverse engineering suites like IDA, Ghidra, or Binary Ninja, with associated necessary custom architectures, loaders, and plugins for these specific tasks. Finally, ensure scripts are dependency-free. That means they're only using the standard Python library. And it's stated here that these scripts also serve as a time capsule, preserving tooling and methodologies for future research, ensuring that knowledge isn't lost as consoles age and potentially see renewed interest. Now, for some of the utilities here, they do break down which exact scripts do what. So for example, this first one is for the secure kernel and BIOS. This automatically extracts secure kernel and BIOS keys from a decrypted secure loader binary. While this method has changed in the past, the current script has remained effective from firmware 1.0 through 13.50 and unchanged since firmware 4.50. The secure module one automatically extracts secure module keys from a decrypted secure module binary. And much like the previous one, it has remained valid from firmwares 1 through 13.50, though it may change in future updates. For the self one here, it automatically extracts self keys from a decrypted auth manager binary. Like the previous ones, it seems to work through firmwares 1.0 up to 13.50. 13.50 is the latest one at the time of recording here. And then for a kernel, this one automatically extracts embedded self files such as mini syscore.elf, safemode.elf, and sce sysavcontrol.elf from a decrypted or dumped kernel ELF. The last one here is split kernel, which separates the AMD Mu BIOS and FreeBSD kernel from a decrypted kernel ELF to mimic the structure of a typical kernel dump. So while, as I'll say, these ones here are far above my level and really kind of what I do in terms of the console modding space here, if you are interested in checking out some reverse engineering and trying it yourself on the PS4, these seem like some pretty handy scripts to have on hand, so this will of course be linked with everything else and you can give these a try. Now there's been a few funnily named releases from developer Gezine, and these have been for the PlayStation 5. Now this here is BD-UNJB, which it states is BDJB for already jailbroken PS5. Keep in mind the syntax there and how that is stated. This is not BDJB to jailbreak a PS5. This is BDJB for already jailbroken PS5s. Reading up on this here, they state you need already jailbroken PS5. BD-UNJB is a remote jar loader that can be used on an already jailbroken PS5 up to 12.00 firmware. It supports on-screen logging and network logging. What you need to do is send the BD_unpatch elf to the elf loader to unpatch BDJB. BDJ unpatch elf will back up the existing BDJ stack jar to BDJ stack jar back just in case. Then you need to burn the BD-UNJB ISO and run it. They do state though, do not reinstall firmware, it will wipe the patch and lose BDJB. Now, for anybody who might be confused by exactly what I said, I'm going to need to give some context here, and I've talked about this in the last episode and maybe even the episode prior to that. Essentially, people have talked about unpatching these systems themselves. Now, the thing is, let's say you have a PS5 on this higher firmware of 12.00. Currently, in order to jailbreak it, the only way that is known to jailbreak it is to use Star Wars Racer Revenge. You either need a disk or you need it already installed and activated on that system and then taken offline sometime after it was purchased. So you need to be on that outdated firmware. Now what you can do if you do not have that available is you could use a physical copy of the game to unpatch BDJ itself. What I mean by that is actually what I mentioned earlier from Dr. Yin Yin here, in which he stated, I'll repeat it again, BDJ is also difficult to work with and a usable one hasn't been available past 7.61. Although we can unpatch a BDJ exploit with another jailbreak. This still doesn't solve for needing the very expensive game first if you are on 10.20 up to 12.00. So essentially, if you're on firmware 7.61 or lower, you can just burn yourself a BDJB disk, put it in your system, run it, and jailbreak it. If you're on any higher firmware, you cannot do that. But this here is nice because essentially what this can be used for is, let's say somebody is running an unpatching service, because now people are starting to do that. Let's say you have someone or you're able to borrow the Star Wars Racer Revenge disk. You can end up loading it up into your system and then you end up using that to jailbreak your system. From there, you end up sending this BDJ unpatch elf to the system, and what it does is it ends up unpatching instead of patching, because after 7.61, the BDJ functionality on the system itself was patched to end up patching out that jailbreak option. However, this just undoes that. Kind of like what I've mentioned with HFW before over on the PS3 side, and that is hybrid firmware. And they even state here, again, this on the PS3, but they state here, hybrid firmware by its very nature is a modified version of the original official firmware. That by itself can be unstable or have unexpected results in some situations due to the system files SPRX replaced with older version during the creation process. HFW is meant to be accompanied by PS3HEN, which when fully installed will restore HFW back to an official firmware state, system SPRX, and also includes any other fixes needed. However, this here is being mentioned because what HFW does is it ends up bringing an old WebKit over to a newer firmware. So that way you can be on a higher firmware with an older version of the WebKit, and therefore you can use any of the browser-based exploits on the PS3. That's a lot of context I had to add here, and again, I know it's confusing, but I'm sure that's going to be helpful for people who don't know what I'm talking about here, but that's what this is capable of doing. If you're able to jailbreak a system with Star Wars Racer Revenge From there, you can then end up using this BDJ unpatch elf to load up that older version of the BDJ stack jar file, and that way, at that point, even though your system is on a higher firmware, as long as you don't reinstall the firmware, because that will wipe it, so as long as you're good there, you can take an old BDJB disk, load it up in your system, and after that, you can use it to jailbreak the system. And even if we look at the releases here, it is, yes, you have a Hello World jar, you also have this BDJ unpatch elf, and then you have the ISO right here. So again, like I've said, the idea would be you jailbreak the system using Star Wars Racer Revenge, you then load up this ISO onto a disk, and then once it loads up, you then use something like a computer or your phone to send over this BDJ unpatch elf. I can actually show you a visual of it thanks to Dr. Yin Yin. So right here we have this tweet from them saying BDJ unpatch is basically 2 minutes to get done, jailbreak with Star Wars, send the elf payload, and then switch to the BDJ disk. And you can see right here they were executing a payload, and right here, yeah, it's about 2 minutes long. You can see that the remote Lua loader has loaded up here. It is on firmware 10.60, and right here, bootstrapping the elf loader, executed, spawning that, serving the elf loader. So let's go ahead and wait a little longer. I'll probably cut out some of the waiting time here as well, just so we can get to it all quicker. And here we go. It took some time, but it said patch bdjstack.jar, so that is exactly like the one I was talking about. And then from here, it looks like he exits. Yep, he was able to close out of Star Wars Racer Revenge. So it is a disk-based version, so he ended up removing the disk from his system and giving it some time. I'm going to pause this real quick. Now you can see here once it loads in. There we go, disk player, we have BD-UN-JB 1.0. So he just loads that up through the Blu-ray player. And from here, it looks like, yep, the jar loader is listening on port 9025. Exploit success, the sandbox escape achieved. So it looks like we're good on that. Hello from external jar. So boom, we got all that. So there we go, that's a little of how that's going. And while this is not the only jailbreak ISO available, there's now people who are making different jailbreak ISOs, so that way you can actually, well, jailbreak the system to your heart's content in, different ways, better ways and all that. And looks like here, checking that, yep. That's running 10.60, so just showing the evidence there. Now, if that wasn't enough of a funny name and complex enough, we have another one here from Gezine called BD-Not-JB. They do state here, before anybody gets too excited on this, they do state here that this is for developers only. BD-Not-JB is a remote jar loader that can be used on every PS4 and PS5 firmware without escaping the sandbox. It supports on-screen logging and network logging. So that way, if you are a developer and you're wanting to do some research or some reverse engineering on here, you do have access to BD-Not-JB, and while this is, again, I'm saying this here, this is not a jailbreak disk. It even states BD-Not-JB. This is not a jailbreak disk. This is not a jailbreak ISO. None of that stuff. It does allow this to be used on every single firmware. That remote jar loader can be used on every firmware on every PS4 and PS5. You just cannot escape that sandbox, which is still really awesome here. Looking at this, you do have this ISO, so if you do want to play around with it, you can just download it and burn it. Now for the PS5, some good news, we do have an actual kernel exploit which has released, meaning that this does work to jailbreak the PS5, like a full kernel exploit and everything up to firmware 12.00. And this is Poop's PS5. This is a BDJ kernel exploit and elf loader. And they state here that this is a Java implementation of the Poop's PS5 sys net control use after free kernel exploit for PS5 BDJ. This achieves arbitrary kernel read-write, root privileges, enables debug settings, and deploys an elf loader. Now do keep in mind here, wait a minute, actually, because I'm referencing this, I do have to reference this.
Look, we're adults in here, you can say it.
Poop?
You said poop! I said! I said poop in here!
Poop!
Now that that's done, do keep in mind here that I had to explain all the other stuff previously about unpatching, about BDJ only working directly up to 7.61, and then anything higher than that, you need to unpatch it. Because this here doesn't suddenly mean, oh, if I have a newer PS5 on firmware like 11 or 12, something like that, I can just download this and jailbreak right away. No. Unfortunately, this is Poopsploit, which has been ported to BDJB, and it does work up to firmware 12.00, but in order to get up to those higher firmwares, you still need to unpatch the BDJ stack on your system. Just getting that out of the way here. And if you don't believe me, they even state right here in the requirements a PS5 on firmware 12.00 or below with an unpatched BDJ environment and a functional BDJ loader environment running on the console. And they even used right here for our testing and development, we successfully used the BD-UNJB 1.0 ISO, which includes the jar loader utilizing the Flows API. So you see how I kind of stacked up everything and kind of had to explain it here. I know I front loaded you all with a lot of information, but it all kind of had to work together here. Either way, this does give us full kernel read-write permissions, privilege escalation, access to the debug settings, as well as an ELF loader right here. We also have some releases here. It looks like there's been 1.0 and 1.1, and we really just have this poops.jar right here. So they show some stuff with what's new here. So for example, they've been able to reduce kernel panics. The native sleep time precision has been tweaked there, and there's also been some streamlined execution that's happened right there. But for the usage, they state that you need to boot the BDJ loader ISO on your PS5 and wait for it to start listening on port 9025. And at that point, then you need to take this poops.jar and you send it. And at that point, you're good. You've been able to run the kernel exploit on your system and you have a successful jailbreak. Now, kind of slightly out of the realm of jailbreak here, but still in the world of modding and in the PS5, we have something that is pretty impressive right here. Actually, two things I'm going to show you all. The first thing is EmuCore, and this is from developer, I'm going to have to spell this out, EGYCNQ. This is EmuCore, which they state are emulators running as a native x86-64 shellcode on the PS5 through the LuaCore just-in-time exploit. Now, this is something I had talked about in a previous episode here, but this is exciting because essentially with LuaCore, this is a MasterCore variation here, and this is launched through a PlayStation 2 game. So for example, MasterCore was for Okagi, but this one here uses Star Wars Racer Revenge. But this one is exciting because the just-in-time exploit, like I'd mentioned in the previous episode, gives us more abilities than we've had before, like to the point where we can actually, even without a kernel exploit, we can run some level of homebrew on these systems, meaning that if you have access to this game on the latest firmware, I'm going to repeat that, if you have access to this on the latest firmware, you can actually utilize this. Now with the just-in-time exploit, this is certainly not a full jailbreak, mind you, not even close with that, but this is giving us some nice unsigned code here. So for example, if you have Star Wars Racer Revenge on your system and it's on the latest firmware, you can pair this up with EmuCore and you can utilize this to have a Nintendo emulator on here. This is the first emulator in this EmuCore project here, and this here has several options. It states that it works for NTSC and PAL games. There's a ROM picker menu, a built-in FTP server for ROM upload, web-based touched and web HID controller, DualSense native pad support, APU with 48 kHz output, PPU with scrolling sprites and sprite 0 hit, and full 6502 CPU, all 256 opcodes including illegals. For the requirements here, they state that you just need a PS5 console, any firmware tested up to 13.00, LuaCore set up and running, and you also need Star Wars Racer Revenge. Now the nice thing is here, it states if you're on the latest firmware, you can grab the digital version from the PlayStation Store. So you still need to, of course, buy this game, but you're no longer locked to the physical version of it. You can just buy the digital version right here. And if that wasn't enough, we also have SNES Core from Brenu TK, which much like this, it states that SNES Core is based on the EmuCore NES Emulator by the EGY dev team or EGY-CNK, and its usage is basically identical. I'm very happy to be able to contribute in some way to the scene, and I truly hope you enjoy it. I'm also open to bug reports, feedback, and possible improvements. This pretty much has the same requirements as before, and as opposed to this being a Nintendo emulator, well, this is a Super Nintendo emulator and core. There is a to-do list right here in which they want to improve save games. There's going to be future planning for a PS1 emulator, and there's even plans for a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive emulator. So this is some of the first big substantial stuff that we're really seeing with this just-in-time exploit here. Again, this is exciting because like I've said, I'm repeating this several times here. While this one is not a full jailbreak, it is different. You have to think of this one differently here. This is a way where you can take a PS5, a PS5 Slim, a PS5 Pro on the latest firmware, and as long as you even buy just a digital copy of Star Wars Racer Revenge right now, you can play Nintendo and Super Nintendo games on it. and more coming soon thanks to this just-in-time method. I'm sorry to kind of rain on the parade here, but I also did want to share this because this is some news here, and even though this is disappointing, well, you know, I really don't blame them on here, and this is their own decision. Gezine, the person who I've really been singing praises on so many of these episodes for a hot minute now, end up tweeting here on March 26, stating, "I am no longer releasing anything public from now on. I am tired of this scene. Gonna focus on write-ups and homebrew stuffs, will maintain existing stuffs though. Example, LuaCore." So I essentially said this same thing on Twitter, and I essentially said, you know, to Gezine, you know, rest easy on here. This is their decision. However, I also understand where they're coming from, and whilst I'm not trying to talk directly for Gezine, one thing that has been quite annoying is that in this scene, and specifically, I think it's probably just because they are so big and there's so many people who have them, and the level of access is lower in some way. You know, it's software only, but the PS4 scene and even the PS5 scene it's been seen now, for a lot of people, the requests are never enough. When a jailbreak is released, people immediately want the next jailbreak. If you're not working on something quickly, they want you to work on it quicker. If you release something, they want even more. It's constant asking and asking and asking, and there's just not a lot of grateful people that are at least visible and loud. There are many people who are grateful, mind you, and this is to the people who I've interacted with, for example, who I would consider friends, who I would consider mutuals, who I've had good experiences with. I am not talking about you all, but I'm talking about the people who ask ETA when, the people who are constantly bugging for updates, who are begging for different functionalities, for different applications, and of course who even complain about things that are being released for free for really volunteer effort on here. Those are the people that I'm talking about, and to you all, I'll say, you all suck. And usually when, I'm going to be honest, I'm just going to say this, usually when I have those comments and stuff on my channel here, I just straight up block those people, because you know what, if I just have to pander and deal with those people, this is not fun anymore. But you know what, for me to continue doing this, just myself here, for me to continue doing videos like this and, you know, doing developments like this and such, I still want to have fun. And for many developers, many reverse engineers, if they're not having that level of fun, what's the point in them being here? That's what they start to question on there. So if you're one of those people that I'm talking about, if you're begging, if you're bugging developers, if you're being ungrateful, you suck. Like, you really suck. Again, the people who are good, who I've had good interactions with and all that, I'm not talking about you all, but even what I'm saying here should not be controversial. I'm just going to say that. And I'll even say this as well too. If you are offended by what I have said just now in this little segment, you need to step back and you need to ask yourself why you're offended, because I don't think I've said anything controversial here. Let's continue on though. Short and sweet, if you've ever wanted Minesweeper on the Xbox 360, boom, we now have 360 Sweeper. This here is from developer Xenon Wotjon. Hopefully I'm saying that right here, but you can see here, these are some screenshots of it, so you got that, and this is just, well, Minesweeper on Xbox 360. Debatably one of the best games ever right here. Really cool to see. You are going to need to have an Xbox 360 which is capable of running some kind of unsigned code. It looks like this here is interesting as well too. I thought this was just going to be raw files, but they actually end up releasing this as a games on demand container, or I guess XBLA. It goes in the content directory is what I'm saying. It's not the raw files on here, but that's really cool. It looks like there's been 2 versions of it so far, the initial release as well as this one here, in which they fixed a visual bug in the controls with the question texture, and when remapping controlled, actions text now switch to that, and some code cleanup. So really cool to see. I don't think I really need to say much more about Minesweeper. It's pretty addicting for a lot of people. So now you have another device where you can play it on. So now we're going to be going back a few generations to the PSP of all things, one of my favorite consoles just in general, and I would say definitely my favorite handheld of all time here. Now this is from developer qBirdie, and they've ended up releasing Dratini File System, or Dratini FS, and Leftovers, which essentially means this is exFAT and 1TB support for the PSP with ExtremeSpeed. Now they've ended up doing a huge write-up on this here, so I'm only going to pick and choose a few of the things here, but in short they've tried to solve some of the problems with the PSP, one of them being the storage limitation and the other one being speed. Kind of answering that in reverse, the speed aspect of this here, while the PSP is still great, it does have its slowdowns, especially if you put more content on there on larger SD cards. And with the storage here, the main issue with that is if you have utilized a PSP, yes, you can throw in like a 400GB, 512GB SD card, like a micro SD card, but if you actually start filling that thing up, it's not going to be entirely usable, and you actually end up getting a lot of data corruption. So from what I've seen, and actually Total Commando is shouted out here, from what I've seen from his tests, current day, unless you're doing any of these mods here that I'm going to be showing, if you just get a PSP, install custom firmware on it, and want to throw a card in there, the highest you can really safely go is going to be 128 gigabytes. Now they state here that Dratini OS is a full file system replacement for Sony's fatms.prx. Yes, that means it replaces your fatms.prx file in Flash 0. It allows the PSP to detect and use FAT32, exFAT, and most importantly, exTremeSpeed, a completely new PSP ISO specific file system that is extremely fast. I made exTremeSpeed not as an alternative to FAT32 or exFAT, but to live alongside either one of them on your SD card. Leftovers is a plugin initially designed to overcome the SD card size limitation to support up to 1 to 2 terabyte SD cards. The idea is simple. Create multiple partitions under 400 gigabytes inside of your 1 terabyte and design an efficient and quick way to swap between them without needing to physically touch the SD card but still allowing the same performance. Now with leftovers here, they have a video that is showing this, and I'll kind of read this at the bottom they state, but they say you need to copy the PSP leftovers PRX to your Flash 0 and its accompanying config file to Flash 1 and boot your PSP with any size SD card. You can prepare the SD card itself with any partition manager. I've tested with Minitool and Aomi. Make up to 12 to 16 FAT32 32 kilobyte partitions of any size below 441 gigabytes each and fill it with the typical memory stick folders you're used to. You can also rename each partition whatever you want. Put your ISOs or homebrew on each partition as you normally would in each partition to fully utilize the entire SD card. Launch your games and enjoy maximum storage. So just going back on this video, you could see this gentleman here, he is taking the SD card, he's popping it into the PSP, and once it is loaded up, let's see here, I was able to see a bit of that magic, so you could see even in the corner, in the top right corner, I'll actually blow this up here. So in the top right corner of the screen, it loads in, it says main 91 gigabytes. So that's going to be the first partition right there. And this is how everything is set up, right? So they go into the game selection and we have Wipeout Pulse right there. Everything's showing up just fine. Now they're able to do this little command and it changes to 333 gigabytes. So it unmounts the SD card, remounts it, and you have something different. They do the command, blaze it, is 420 gigabytes, so that is the other partition. Now that one loads in, and if they go into there, you have the exit ISO. So while it's not going to be, it is really fast, this is awesome, but for anybody who's wanting something that is just completely seamless, last one, 107 gigabytes. So this you could see here is the memory card itself, or I guess the micro SD card that has been partitioned into 4 chunks. And while again, this is really fast, this is really impressive to see, the thing is, for anybody who thinks you can just do this with one single partition and throw everything on there, no, you're not going to be able to do that. This actually, you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of those old PS1 memory cards. You all might remember them, like especially the 2X memory cards. They were the third-party ones where they would essentially have an LED and a button on the memory card. And I remember one of them specifically, it was very similar to this. If you plug it into your PS1, a standard memory card was 15 blocks and you could not change it. But if you press the button, the green LED, for example, would flip to red. Then it would unmount the first memory card, mount up a new memory card, and then from there you had a whole other 15 blocks that you could work with all on the same device. That's pretty much the same idea right here. Now, right now, there are some known issues and workarounds here, and they state that when using unsupported SD cards, plugins don't load properly. USB mode is also inconsistent. It depends on the card speed and erase condition within the custom firmware. Waking from sleep in the XMB will sometimes flash an unsupported error before fully remounting the partition. Sometimes the neon light fading animation I tried to show on screen when swapping partitions will sometimes fade in between 200 to 300 milliseconds later, again due to another race condition, and for the life of me I couldn't make it so that holding L and R blocked X and B directional input when you're selecting partitions. So when you hold L and R, you still navigate the X and B while you're also selecting partitions. Please helps me anyone. So even with those limitations there, this is still incredibly cool to see, and one thing I'd be interested in, because I do know that ARC 4, the custom firmware, is still getting active development on it, and I also know that there's active development with the ARC 5 custom firmware. I do wonder how much of these developments here can get integrated into the ARC custom firmwares and how seamlessly they can just really directly integrate it in there and even improve upon it. Which I'm sure that's some of the hope here as well too, because if stuff like this is directly baked into the firmware and it's made even better, I mean, I'm sure that would convince so many more people to upgrade from old legacy custom firmwares over to ARC. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We're going to be talking about this one, which is Dratini FS with exTremeSpeed. It's stated here this is a full replacement for Sony's built-in file system that supports a minimum FAT32 call set, full spec exFAT format support, and the new PSP ISO specific exTremeSpeed or ES raw partition that is quite literally extremely fast. We do have this screenshot right here, which, oh, it's not all too, I'm just gonna have to blow it up like this. There we go here. But yeah, you can see here the zero overhead ISO partition for Dratini FS, and just looking at the options, there is show partition info, create exTremeSpeed partition, list exTremeSpeed ISOs, transfer an ISO to exTremeSpeed, transfer an ISO to the memory stick, transfer all ISOs to exTremeSpeed, transfer all ISOs to memory stick, delete ISO from exTremeSpeed, reclaim exTremeSpeed space, or format the memory stick. So again, this here exTremeSpeed is a completely separate partition here that works in conjunction with everything. It says here, now while exFAT on PSP is pretty big in general, getting to that point will let me fully exercise the partition of this replacement as a faster and lower latency way to read from a pretty slow system by today's standards. The PSP was never designed for modern SD cards. Sony's driver tops out at FAT32, which limits files to 4 GB and chokes on large volumes. Dratini FS fixes this at the kernel level, same hardware, same custom firmware, ARC4, and dramatically better performance. Now when the PSP loads a game ISO from the memory stick, every single read goes through a chain of abstractions. First you have the cluster chain traversal, you have the FAT sector reads, and directory lookups. For a typical 1.5 GB PSP game ISO on a FAT32 file system with 32 KB clusters, this results in some very slow speeds. From what I could test directly from hardware probing on a PSP 1000 model, you can check this out right here. Clusters to traverse from FAT32 stock to exTremeSpeed, it drops from 48,000 to 0. For FAT sector reads, it goes from about 375 to 0. For cluster chain lookups per read, it goes from at least 1 on average to 0. I/O operations for a full read goes from around 400 to around 24. And the I/O reduction, this is at the baseline for FAT32 or exTremeSpeed, you have 16.7 times fewer ops. And they state here that's not a typo. exTremeSpeed reduces I/O operations by over an order of magnitude. Seriously. And that's pretty impressive right there. And now with some of the benefits, going from FAT32 to exFAT, for the max file size, you go from 4 GB to an unlimited size. For the cluster chain entries per gigabyte, you go from 32,000 to around 8,000. For the FAT cache coverage, you go from 4 MB to 16 MB. And for the bitmap scan initialization, well, that's not available here through file system info on the FAT32 version, but on exFAT you have a full scan. There's also a mention here of punch buffer, in which they state that this is a term we often use in speedrunning games as a way to sync up time and movement to ensure frame accuracy. In programming, it's called an input buffer or an event buffer, and when dealing with variable speeds, they should never be relied on when it comes to coalescing some sort of consistency in your code. In this case, I made an exception. The internal punch buffer will effectively slow down the boot process for the system and custom firmware to catch up and allow custom game functions to run. However, it's not perfect and is still inconsistent between identical PSPs, even identical SD cards, but not between identical batched SD cards. Interesting there. So I wanted to explain the punch buffer because it does come up later here. They state here that for some of these known issues and workarounds, yet again here, depending on the SD card and format type, plugins may or may not load. If it works, lucky you. Games that use game ID may lose the race condition even with the punch buffer. So some games I've seen with the data install feature, such as Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, will fail to copy. Either do the data install from FAT32 and then run the ES game, or run all data installs beforehand and copy them over to your exFAT ES SD card. And if your exFAT format is wonky or weird, try using the ES Homebrew's built-in formatting tool. Yes, the ES app will still be on your SD card after the format. And there's also a warning here, which I will say to the developer, this is just my own just recommendation here on this, because I know a lot of people will be really excited and try to just install this and kind of not read a whole lot and then ask about a bunch of issues. I'd actually recommend having this attention warning here probably at the top of the article, just as kind of more of a heads up there. But they do state that Dratini FS is highly experimental. It replaces a crucial component of your PSP's firmware and could brick your device. Please only use it if you have CIPL installed, a NAND backup, time machine, magic memory stick, DC Arc setup with a Pandora battery as backup. All development and my personal testing has been on a PSP 1000 with Arc 4 version 205. Other testing has been on a 3000 model. Be careful. So if you want to give these a try here, there are a few versions that have been released here, and you have the downloads for Dratini FS as well as leftovers here. They also have their own Discord for this as well too, and also if you do like their work, you can buy them a coffee right here, which, okay, seriously, I have to verify this right now? Okay. Here we go. This is through Fuzzy Logic, but if you want to support them directly, you're more than welcome to. Now here's something I've actually never referenced before here. This one's going to be a little odd because this is from Tanaka, and this is on Note, which I've never even been on this site, honestly, and I'm going to give a heads up here that all this was originally written in Japanese, and I'm using my browser to translate it to English, so there's going to be some things I might not understand, simply because they're lost in translation here. But this here is called Madness PSP. The PSP's performance was not just twice as good, but 3 times as good, and this is with a benchmarking tool they have released here. The benchmarking tool has actually been released here at the bottom, and this is from, well, their other username is can8223.com, and this is the PSP ME benchmark. Now this specifically is not talking about Millennium Edition like a custom firmware on here, but they are talking about some ways that the PSP could really be pushed here, and there was even a correction in which they stated that there's been no homebrew that makes practical use of ME for 20 years, but it looks like there were some previous cases where using this existed, such as SNES 9X-TYL. But getting into this here, this is actually an article on top of a previous article, because they stated that they wrote before that they were able to double the performance of the PSP, but that's actually not true. It was actually about 3.5 times, or up to 4.3 times, or up to 4.33 times multiplied on the performance. Yeah, Yeah, here to quantitatively measure the effective performance of the Media Engine, we created the world's first dual CPU benchmark app. Again, this is on the PSP here. 3 types of measurements were performed: pi, prime enumeration, and Mandelbrot set in 4 patterns: a single CPU, dual CPU, at 222 MHz/333 MHz, at least to the extent that it had been published. No examples were found in which the Media Engine and the main CPU were quantitatively evaluated simultaneously on a PSP. And you can see right here, essentially the thing that they're going to be talking about is doing 2 CPUs running to the maximum speeds on a PSP. So not only the system CPU, which is abbreviated to SC, but also the Media Engine, both of them running at 333 MHz, which technically is the highest the PSP is spec'd to go. There were some games, such as the God of War games, were officially able to use that higher clock speed, but it looked like clocking both of them at a higher speed was very rarely done. I was going to say it wasn't done before, but they even said that some previous homebrew did this, so this was incredibly rarely done, and I'm not sure how often it was done in official capacity either. It's even talked about right here with the system CPU set to 222 MHz. That is the clock that Sony had limited to official games, and they released 333 MHz in 2007 with firmware 3.50. Again, I do remember that. The PSP's nominal performance when released in 2005, dual 222 MHz, that means you have to start the Media Engine and leave it at 222 MHz with 2 CPUs in parallel. Measure purely the effectiveness of the Media Engine without clock up. The system CPU being set to 333 MHz shows that the main CPU is only at 333 MHz. That is the full clock when released with custom firmware, and the Media Engine is unused. However, this one here is addressing dual 333 MHz. That means 2 CPUs in parallel and full clock, the true performance of the PSP. Now, there's a lot of really nerdy stuff with the numbers and such here that you can read up on this, so I'm really only just kind of picking some of the highlights right here, but this is really interesting because when you get to point number 4, they say that 0 performance difference between the PSP 1000 and 3000. when both models were, just take that in, but they state here when both models were run on the same benchmark, the difference was about 0.03 to 0.06%. The margin of error, proof by measurement that they are the same AllegreX core. Media Engine works fine on the PSP 3000. This is using the kcall PRX SE plugin method here. Now they did try some more overclocking, and they did try to set it to 370 megahertz here, and they were able to get a report of success, and they were able to see that it was reporting 370 megahertz, but they state that the actual CPU clock remained at 333 megahertz. So it looks like that's really about the highest we're going to be able to get on the PSP itself. They even state here that when they test on the PSP 3000, 444 megahertz setting immediately froze, and the 407 megahertz setting worked stably, but the effective performance remained equivalent to 333 megahertz without a plugin, and no effective overclock effect could be confirmed. So this is really interesting to see here because, again, they've done their tests with a benchmarking app, mind you, but they stated that when it initially released in 2005, this was limited, the CPU clock for games was limited to 222 megahertz, and then at that point, the restriction was lifted with firmware 3.50, and games were able to run at 333 megahertz, but they stated that the 222 megahertz standard was used to maximize the effectiveness of the media engine compared to the PSP's most constrained state. Even at the 333 megahertz standard, the dual has been shown to be approximately twice as fast. It runs 2 CPUs, but Sony only allowed one to be used. So 21 years later, it has started up a CPU that was not allowed to be used. Again, if that sounds a little bit odd, it's because there's a translation here, but this is essentially like we're seeing here in a, I guess, refreshed light here, power being unlocked on the PSP that was kind of hidden there the whole time. And it's even covered a little bit here, and there's some questions here, like common questions, in which they ask, can't you just change the clock for the media engine? And the answer is probably not. SCE power set clock frequency changes the clocks on the main CPU and bus, but I haven't seen an API to control the media engine clock independently. The media engine operates at the same clock as the main CPU. And they also asked, is there a performance difference between the PSP 1000 and 3000? CPU media engine is common to all models. The benchmark results were also identical for the PSP 1000 and the PSP 3000. The only difference is the RAM, which is 32 megabytes for the 1000 and 64 megabytes for the 2000 and later. Now you all might be asking, why was the media engine sealed by Sony? And they stated here that the official SDK only allowed the media engine to be used for limited purposes, such as video decoding and A-Track 3 playback. The exact reason is unknown, but it is assumed to be for security, because the media engine operates in kernel mode, to manage battery consumption and to avoid unstable use by third parties. The last two I also want to touch up on here. One of them is asking, does dual CPU consumption increase power consumption? And the answer, it really gets you going. I bought a new compatible battery and am using it, but the battery is running low at a great rate. However, I only recently started playing with the PSP seriously, so I don't have anything to compare it to. To begin with, the media engine is running at 333 MHz on the same AllegreX as the main CPU, and is always energized whether or not the media engine is working. Power consumption may not change from the normal 333 MHz operation. I haven't taken accurate measurements. And finally, has media engine been known about for some time? Yes. Media Engine is known as a hardware configuration for the PSP, and there have been builds in the custom firmware community that utilize Media Engine with emulators such as SNES 9X TYL. However, no examples of quantitative benchmarking of the effective performance of Media Engine were found in the published range. So this is really interesting here to me. Not only, I mean, I don't really go over benchmarks here on the channel, but this is interesting because again, this is just a benchmarking application. You can check it out yourself and everything. You can check out the article here. With kind of even more of a push and a renewed interest for the PSP, I really wonder how much more the PSP can be pushed if developers end up taking applications and either writing them or even rewriting them with the media engine running at a higher speed, and I guess doing dual 333 megahertz as they talk about between the system CPU and the media engine on one. Like, how much more performance can we squeeze out of our homebrew, games, applications, like anything on the PSP? I'd really be interested to see where that goes, if it's able to go somewhere, but Awesome stuff to see, man. This has been a really long episode yet again. I don't try to make these episodes super long. It's just there's been so much dense stuff to cover here. So I'm going to have these next 4 topics go over pretty quickly here. I don't know if I've covered this one. This has been picking up some traction online I've seen here. This is the Silent Hill Decompilation project, which at the moment is a decompilation project. It's an in-progress one of the 1.1 US release of Silent Hill on the PS1. This is important to note, though, that the project itself is not and will not produce a port to PC or any other platform. It is a decompilation of the original game code, which can be compiled back into a binary identical to the original. Now, this here is something I want to talk about because not only Silent Hill is one of the greatest games ever, but this here is getting pretty close to being fully decompiled. At the time I'm recording this, maybe this will change when it comes out, but at the time I'm recording this here, you could see the total progress of this game being decompiled is 99.88%. So far, they've been able to decompile the main executable to 100%. Now, the actual main game logic has been decompiled to 99.21%. And for the game screen overlays and the map overlays, those ones have been decompiled 100%. However, for the actual match data, that is at a lower 8.4%. And this here is exciting because I didn't even know about this, right? I think it was kind of just like memory hold in my head, but I didn't realize that the first Silent Hill, like Silent Hill 2, I think 3 and 4 got PC ports. Silent Hill, the original one, never got a PC port. It just stayed on the PS1. That's been it. So that's why people have been excited about this, because even though this is just a decompilation effort, once this game is fully decompiled, people can typically take that code, and they take that code and they can use it to make a PC port. And then it can be ported to other platforms to run natively on other platforms. So as opposed to emulating the game on, let's say, Switch, for example, you could have a homebrew natively running Switch port of Silent Hill, which would be cool to see. I would certainly want to play it on there. But either way, this is getting exciting. We're going to get to see how it goes. I have seen some folks who have taken work in progress PC ports of this code, and they've been able to compile them and play them. But it is buggy. It is incomplete. There's going to be issues. So I would say just be patient and wait on this. But this is an exciting one. This is going to be something that I'm going to be paying attention to. If you've ever wanted to run Mac OS X on the Nintendo Wii, you can do that now thanks to developer Brian Keller here. This is thanks to wiiMac, which it says it enables PowerPC versions of Mac OS X to be booted natively on the Nintendo Wii. And so far, Cheetah, which is 10.0, is working on here. There's some limitations stating that the following is not supported yet, so no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, no optical drive, no hardware accelerated graphics, and no audio. But if you want to get this set up here for the prerequisites, you're going to need a Wii with an SD card slot. You're going to need that Wii to be soft modded. You need your MBR formatted SD card with FAT32 partitioned containing bootme files, and a second SD card that's at least 4 GB for the Mac OS X system. It goes through the process here of setting this all up, but yeah, if you really want to give Mac OS X 10 a shot on your Wii, you certainly can. And there's active development happening on this as well. I mean, you see this is open source, but you can even go to the releases section here, and it's still being worked on right now. At the time of recording, yesterday was the first release, and there's already a 1.0.1 release right here. So if you want to play around with this, go ahead, have some fun. I always love seeing what's happening in the Dreamcast scene because there's just so much cool stuff that's happening there, and this is something I didn't even know about. But this is from developer Derek Pascarella, who I've covered a lot of his work before, but this here is DreamMovie Unlocked, which is a patch to finally unlock the best VCD player the second Dreamcast ever saw. DreamMovie Unlocked removes the proprietary IR dongle requirement from the DreamMovie VCD MP3 player, replacing it with full standard Dreamcast controller support. For the first time, anyone with a Dreamcast can use this software without needing the original and now extremely rare and expensive hardware. And I'm just looking at this here. I've never seen this. I didn't even know this was a thing. Like, this is cool here. You can download this, you can run this and everything. You really just need to download the latest CDI. You can burn it to a CDR if you're going to run it from disk, and then you boot it up in your Dreamcast, and from there you pop in your VCD and you're able to play it from there. There's also instructions for doing this with something such as a GDMU, a mode, a USB GD-ROM, and this I thought was interesting here. There was MP3 support confusion, and I'll read this out because this is funny. Why am I confused? It's simple, really. As a kid, I am almost entirely confident I used DreamMovie to play MP3s burned to CDRs. The packaging itself touts MP3 support. However, no matter what I try, I can't get any basic CDR containing one or more MP3s to be recognized, nor can I get an ISO of said disk to be recognized via any ODE either. Funny enough, one variant of the DreamMovie packaging from Bear City claims SVCD support, which is an outright lie. Does this mean MP3 support is a lie too and I hallucinated the entire childhood Toon Rock and memory? Maybe, but I don't think so. That being said, if you can't get your MP3 discs to work, don't feel too badly. More importantly though, if you can get one to work, please reach out to me. So there is a ton of information on this, a ton of background if you want to see how this worked, how they were able to get this up and running and reverse and everything here. But in short, if you want to play VCDs on your Dreamcast, you certainly can, just with this modified ISO. It's now been unlocked. And I would say the functionality it's kind of similar to, even though it's not a DVD, it's kind of similar to what we saw on the original Xbox, where instead of needing to have the DVD remote, and this is a big, like, I'm not kidding, like 20, 25 years ago, this is a big selling point to soft modding your system. People said if you soft modded it, you could do that, and that way you could use, I don't remember what the program was. I think it was called like DVDX, something like that. But you could use an application to watch DVD movies on your original Xbox and use the controller as a remote as opposed to buying the dongle and using the IR blaster on there. So similar thing we're seeing here, just really cool to see it like so many years later. Now for the last thing here, I do like to try and cover something in the world of modding that is funny, cool, random, or maybe even something that is like tangentially related or indirectly related to the world of modding here. And this I thought would be perfect. And you know what? That's why we're kind of ending off on the Dreamcast stuff here. This is from an article from Phoronix here, but they state that Linux sees fixes for its GD-ROM driver in 2026 for Sega Dreamcast. And reading this off from Michael Larabel, they state here, seeing new Linux patches for benefiting Sega Dreamcast devices wasn't on my bingo card for 2026. A patch series was sent out today for fixing the Linux kernel's GD-ROM driver for accessing media using the drivers on real Sega Dreamcast devices. GD-ROM is the proprietary optical disc format used on the Dreamcast and a few other Sega devices for storing more data than CD-ROM at the time. To much surprise, this morning on the Linux kernel mailing list were a set of fixes to deal with block I/O and capacity settings with the GD-ROM driver. With current Linux releases, a kernel oops would occur and render an unusable drive, but with the two patches, a disk can mount and you are able to make use of the inserted media. Now to quote here, this series fixes a GD-ROM driver oops due to bad MMIO register access and fixes the missing updates of the block layer gen disk capacity that prevented ISO 9660 mounts from working. The change was tested on real Sega Dreamcast devices, PAL-E and NTSC-J, with physical CDR disks and with GDMU emulated disks. Before, oops on mount and an unusable drive. After, successfully able to mount and use the inserted medium. So there you go. There you go. Linux got fixes for the GD-ROM driver, if you even knew that was a thing on Linux. Either way, that is about it for this episode of ModChat. So thank you all so much for hanging out, listening, watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, I'm glad you did. If you got to learn something, that is awesome. If you were entertained, even better, and if you didn't like it for whatever reason, you know what, it's kind of impressive that you made it to the end of this episode and you didn't like it, because I'm just going to be honest, if it was me and I didn't rock with this, I would have tapped out a long time ago, so like props to you for being so patient. But either way, we're back here with the Grand Theft Auto 3 footage, as you can see, and I wanted to include this part of the end, right? So, Grand Theft Auto 3 is my all-time favorite game. I absolutely love this game. This is actually, I would say, it wasn't the first game I played. It certainly wasn't, but it was the game that really got me into gaming, because this was the game where I really felt like I could do anything. It felt like truly I could do anything. I could do whatever I wanted to in this game. And this was the game that made me be like, I need a game system. I need a way to play this game. I need a fix for this. I need this injected into my veins. And it's kind of just turned into a comfort game for me as well, too. It's one of those games you put it in front of me, and it doesn't really matter what platform it's on. I just managed to kind of get sucked into it and have fun. Now, I've beat this countless times. I've never done a 100% run, and I'm not doing it right now. But I've told some friends that what I like to do is every single time I replay this game, I like to do something a little bit differently. And it could just be something inconsequential. It could be something kind of silly. For example, the last time I finished this game, I ended up assigning a rule to myself in which I did not touch the radio dial at all. So anytime I got into a car, whatever radio station was playing, I had to stick with that. And I did that the entire playthrough. And you know what? It was entertaining for me. I did enjoy doing that. This time around, I'm not doing that. I believe if not that one, there was also another playthrough I did where I said, you know what? I'm going to do all the missions, like 100% of the missions. I'm not talking about like the rampages and all that, but like the 73 missions you can do in game, I'm going to do 73 of them. And I did that successfully. However, this time I want to do all that and then a little bit more. I am playing around with the radio, but what I'm doing this time around is I said, you know what? There's so many resources out there. There's so many good resources where I can just like look up videos that really cover everything really well. I'm going to get every hidden package. I've been struggling to do this for so long. I have like a chunk of them memorized, but for whatever reason, I've just never gotten all the packages. And I've had trouble with it, you know, even with strategy guides and looking at crappy screenshots and all that. But now you can just load up a video and follow it and you can get every single one. And it's honestly not really that difficult when you do it that way. So I've been having fun with that. Plus the nice thing is too, when you get 100% of the packages, you get every single weapon available for free at your safe house. You also get the body armor. I think there's even like a police bribe you can get. And you also get $1 million on top of the $1,000 you're getting for every single one that you pick up. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. That's why I'm trying to do this. So why am I talking about Grand Theft Auto 3 here? Well, one, because I love the game, and two, because this is part of the whole outro right here. Typically, I like to pick a keyword or a key phrase, and if you use this keyword or key phrase in a comment on the video upload, I'll know that you've made it to the end. And since we've been talking about hidden packages, you know what? Let's use the word package. How about that? Have you been able to get 100% of the hidden packages on a Grand Theft Auto game? Do you care about the hidden packages on these games? Do you like having to install packages on the PS4, for example? Do you want FPKGs, like fake packages available for PS5 games on the PS5? Are you annoyed at how slow it takes to install packages typically on the PS3, especially if you have one of those older drives? Let me know by using the word package in a comment on the video upload, and I'll know that you made it to the end of this episode. Either way, that's about it for this episode of ModChat. If you enjoyed this episode, a like would absolutely be appreciated, and if you didn't like it, a dislike is fine as well too. But as I always say, this is Mr. Mario, signing off. Thank you all for listening and watching, everyone, and until next time.